Rene Denfeld was born with the heart of a warrior and the soul of a poet. She was writing as soon as she could hold a pen. Denfeld had a rough childhood, but nothing would keep her knocked down. In fact, when she became a parent, writing about it in the New York Times, "By adopting from foster care, I became the mother I needed and rewrote my own story. I got to have a childhood all over again, the right one, filled with cuddles and perseverance, safety and love. If there is such a thing as a cycle of abuse, I broke it over the wheel of my own desire." Tackling hard subjects was her forte, writing nonfiction.
Despite the number of millions of people that we incarcerate, we don't have a lot of connection to who those people actually are as human beings. I knew that I could have written a novel about, for instance, innocent people in prison, because there are a lot of innocent people. But I knew that that would have been a pretty easy thing to do. And I wanted to tackle a harder subject, which is the guilty people in prison, and which I've worked with.
And Rene then returned to writing with her 2014 debut novel, Enchanted. Accolades follow, and so does her next novel, featuring a character much in line with herself, Naomi, a private investigator who mines the trauma of her own past to find a missing girl. And now Naomi's story continues with The Butterfly Girl, a novel, opening a window to the world of homeless children.
And, reading can be a way that somebody really connects with an important issue or cause, and it transforms people.
Leading tonight's discussion is young adult novelist Chris Crutcher, one of the founders of Spokane's Child Protection Team and a licensed family therapist. Please welcome Rene Denfeld and Chris Crutcher to the Northwest Passages stage.
I have to say, to start off, that this was, if they were ever going to get me to come and talk with another author, this was the one to get me to come talk to. I read The Butterfly Girl, and the first thing that popped out was, this is one of the first times that I felt like I was reading and hearing the voice in fiction of so many kids that I worked with over 20, 25, 30 years in this town. And what I thought about it was, I get a lot of this. I understand it. I've been around these kids. But you can't read this book without knowing these kids. You can't read this book without knowing these kids. And I really recommend that you all read it, because it'll change your perspective. And if we're going to take care of the problem that we're talking about, got to get your perspective changed. So I want to start off with an easy question, I hope. Why butterflies?
Why butterflies? Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay. I'm soft-spoken, so if people can't hear me, tell me to speak up a bit. Why butterflies? Well, The Butterfly Girl centers around a 12-year-old homeless girl named Celia. And as I hope we might talk a bit about, it's a very personal story for me because of my own history. And Celia is trying to survive on the streets, which a lot of children do. I know that Spokane, I'm from Portland, Oregon. I know that you guys are experiencing something similar that we're experiencing in a lot of places in the country which is this real epidemic of homelessness. And kind of hidden and seen and unseen in that population are a lot of children. And they're there, but we really don't see them. And I really wanted to capture what life is truly, honestly like for a child who lives on the streets. And it was very important for me to capture how a child that's homeless is still a child. And we all were. I was a child once, and children have a sense of magic and a sense of hope. And a child that's trying to survive something that's kind of unfathomably horrifying still can have a sense of innocence. And so little Celia is surviving on the streets, and she believes in butterflies. She believes that butterflies are going to come save her. So it's this theme that runs through the novel, which actually I found it to be a very hopeful novel because it is very much about resiliency and keeping hope alive, and I think Celia really embodies that.
Yeah, and the butterflies give the reader a certain sense of hope along with it. This I think is an amazing book because it's really hard to read this without just getting sucked into it, without thinking, if I can put a face on this little girl, it could be my kid's face or it could be my grandkid's face or whatever it is. The second that happens, you want to do something about it. Talk a little bit about the fact that you have two characters. This book is told from two narrators. One is a child, one is an adult. They have similar histories, and there's a blending, I think, in there that is there's a perfect balance to this. And talk a little bit about how you did that and why.
Sure. So the butterfly girl, the story alternates between Celia, who is trying to survive on the streets, and then Naomi, who is a character who is in The Child Finder. And Naomi is a young woman investigator who tries to find missing children. And she has this very significant traumatic history of her own. And so, to be really honest, like a lot of fiction writers, my work is heavily inspired by my own experiences. And so these are kind of two flip sides of my own experiences. I was a homeless child myself as a young girl. I am happy to talk about it. It's actually taken me until this point in my life, actually, where I've gotten comfortable talking about it. I think it's a very embarrassing thing in our culture. It's shaming to be homeless, and I think I absorbed a lot of that shame. And it took me a long time to realize that, it genuinely wasn't my fault. I grew up in a family where there was a great deal of crime and violence and abuse and poverty. And so by the time I was a young teenager, it was actually safer for me to be on the streets than it was to be in my home. And I think that probably says a lot. And the way I survived, like Celia in the story, is I spent a lot of time in the public library. And I would absorb myself into books. I vividly remember reading in the public library with books stacked around me, the rain pouring down the windows. And I was one of the lucky ones. I got off the streets. It took a lot of effort. I'm happy to talk about how that happened. And by my early 20s, I actually decided to become a therapeutic foster parent and started taking in children like myself. And I also I went into public defense work. And that's where Naomi came from, is I became an investigator and I started working with rape trafficking victims and other people. And so both these characters are actually two sides of my own experience. And I wanted the novel to reflect not just the child in need, but the adult that can come to help them. Because I really think we all have the capacity for that. We all have the ability to make a change.
I look back thinking that one of the first things that came up when you were talking was that as a reader, every time she went to the library, I felt safe. It was like, because that in the library, not only is she going to be able to go inside herself and find those magical and wonderful things and find the magic from authors' lives and book writers' lives, but it's the library.
Yeah.
It's warm.
And the library, yeah. And particularly when I was on the streets, there were no places for homeless children. The library was the only safe place for me to go. And so when they would flicker the lights off every night, I had to leave, and there was kind of this exodus of homeless people, I had no place to go. Which is why I'm really pleased to hear about this grant that you have here now, where people can start providing safe places and services for homeless children. It's just such a critical issue.
I remember thinking, after working in the world of abuse and neglect and with a lot of foster kids and things like that, I got pretty jaded, thinking that we don't, if once a kid gets over 11, it's a flip of the coin. We say we protect them up to 18, but that doesn't happen. One of the things that I was thinking when knowing that I was going to get to talk to you was this. There's a magical part to this book, and a lot of really, really good literature where the truth is better told as a story than probably as a narrative, as just a journalistic narrative. I read your article about you and the Green River Killer, and it just blows your hair back, but not any more than the danger that she's in and that Celia's in. And I'm wondering what it felt like to write that.
Oh, that's such a good question. It's really important for me to write novels about, how do I put this? In a lot of novels, people like myself, people that have been homeless and traumatized, and as I mentioned, I came from a very abusive background and experienced a great deal of exploitation and trauma as a child. And usually in books, honestly, people like me are just kind of there to be violated and thrown away. It's pretty rare to read a book in which a homeless child, for instance, is shown to be a human being. And it was really important for me to capture that. And I knew that when I was writing this book that probably a lot of really difficult memories were going to come up for me. And I think that's why it took me so long to be able to do it. Because it was a very, to be homeless as a child, it's kind of like you're living in this red-hazed nightmare. It's the most terrifying thing in the world. The library was the only place I was safe. Every place else, you can't sleep because I literally, would crawl under overpasses and wrap up with cardboard, and you never know if somebody's going to crawl in after you. It's a terrifying experience, and so when I was writing the book, I knew that these really hard memories would come back, and they did. And I remember when you're homeless and in the winter, your hair gets wet, and then it freezes. And I just remember walking around the streets of downtown Portland, Oregon, with my hair frozen, and how it sounded like wind chimes. And sleeping under overpasses and waking up, and it had rained in the night, and I would wake up in a mud puddle. And just how shameful that felt, and how completely demoralizing it was. But at the same time, all these really hard memories came back writing it. What really was beautiful and really redemptive for me is I really got back in touch with how I still had this sense of hope. And the beauty that can be found even when you're in hardship. And I think that's something we all relate to. And it's important for me to try to get that across, because we all have trauma, right? We all have grief. We all have hardship. We go through divorces, and people we love die, and really hard things happen in our lives. And yet we can still, even in the midst of struggle, I think we can connect to this beauty of life. And, that life has poetry. Life has joy. And it's so important to recognize that. And I think it's really important to recognize that even homeless children have a right to that joy as well, and a right to that beauty. And so, in the end, the book ended up being actually really healing for me to write.
There's a wonderful passage in there where she talks about, there's a place where she just kind of, she's been being followed by the butterflies, and anyway, she looks up and she sees the sky, and she says, that's the same sky everybody sees. Mm-hmm. And there are people out there who don't think I deserve it. And I had to put the book down when I read that, because we live in a culture, I think, we live in a culture that, where, and you said this just a minute ago, where it's more shameful to be abused than it is to abuse. That the shame comes particularly for the person who's being hurt, the shame comes from not being good enough to be treated well.
Exactly. And I think the shame comes too from this idea of the loss of innocence.
Yes.
And this is something I really have battled my entire life, because we have this attitude towards the victims of some kind of crimes that they're somehow broken or damaged forever. And we treat people that have been victimized like they're broken and damaged forever. And I have to tell you, I don't feel broken. I feel just as innocent as I ever did, you know? And I think it's so important. And nowadays, you know, I've been a therapeutic foster and adoptive parent now for a couple decades, and that's something I really try to teach my children. We can take our traumas and turn them into these strengths that we have. We can use our traumas to help other people. We don't have to let the trauma tell us that we're broken forever. We don't have to believe that message.
And it was one I used to hear all the time in the world of abuse and neglect, particularly as it applied to sexual abuse. Mm-hmm. And the idea was, you know, that a child, a human being, can be ruined. And you hear those kind of things and you kind of believe it. And then all of a sudden you start to think, wait a minute, you're only ruined if you think you're ruined. Mm-hmm. You know, where is that? And I go back, I remember when I started seeing some of these kids, I think I'm changing my idea of what heroism is. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, Superman's not a hero, he's bulletproof. And these kids, Celia's not bulletproof. And Naomi's not only not bulletproof, she's having to live this twice. Mm-hmm. She's living her memory and she's living Celia's life. And one of the other things that I wanted to ask about was that I always wanted Naomi to have the right answer and to get it, you know, and then she would miss. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to know what you were thinking when you wrote that, because there were times when I'm thinking, go save her, go save her.
Yeah, Naomi's a very flawed sort of person, she's a flawed hero, which I think is really important, because it's easy to kind of, you know, it's actually two sides of the same coin, because I think when we tell somebody they've been ruined, it's kind of convenient for us.
Yes.
It's a kind of way to say, well, you've been ruined, your life's over, go away. And that's a way that we kind of avoid a public accountability to each other. Because I feel that, you know, we're all kind of one big family, and we all have a responsibility to each other. And there's different ways to show that. We could volunteer in school, we could help somebody out, we could, you know, there's different ways that we demonstrate that love of humanity for each other. And so by Celia's gotten this idea that people think she's ruined, and it's a way to be dismissed. And for Naomi, too, that's the flip side of it, that when people are in certain professions, you know, we want to cast them as different as well. But Naomi's a very flawed human being. She's not a superhero. She's just one person that's trying to make a difference. And so she makes mistakes. I felt that way, too. There were times writing it, I was like, gosh, Naomi,
I know.
Don't do that.
I want to make this a better, right.
Yeah, and as a writer, actually, it's interesting, because as a writer, I think you have to resist the urge to make people into superheroes, because I want to write real characters that, you know, and because I'm a voracious reader, too, and I'm reading a book, I want to relate to this person. I don't want to think that they're perfect. Right. And so Naomi is not perfect.
I know there are a couple of places in there where you think, I could make this a 200-page book. Right? I could save her now.
Yeah.
Say a little more about your life as a foster mom. Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things that kept coming back to me reading this and just thinking about foster kids was that in this culture, foster care is a flip of the coin. There's some absolutely heroic foster parents and some really, really dangerous foster parents. And it is a flip of the coin to some degree. Mm-hmm. Say a little more about just how you do that.
Sure. You know, actually, I've often said it's the best choice I ever made. It really has been. I was actually, to be honest, I was in my 20s, and I decided I wanted to be a parent, and the idea of giving birth sounded very painful. So I give hats off to every woman in this audience that went through that, because that just sounds exquisitely painful.
I've heard it hurts.
That's what I would have, girlfriends would tell me their birthing stories, and I was like, oh my gosh, you know, I've been through enough already. I don't want to. So that was part of, the motivation, to be honest. But actually, there was a deeper motivation, is I really felt like I'd been through a lot, and I would understand what kids from foster care went through. And, I would not be somebody that would think they're ruined for life. And so I was, I think, 25 when I decided to become a foster adoptive parent. And I have since adopted 3 kids from foster care. I've had other children I fostered. My most recent foster was a beautiful teenage girl. Actually, they were driving her with her garbage bag full of stuff to a shelter, and I got the call for her. It's been, it's not easy. It can be really, really difficult. I think part of what we're talking about with trauma doesn't ruin us, but trauma also hurts us. And we need to carry both those things at the same time. We need to have hope for people that are traumatized, but we have to also tend to their needs. And we live in a society where people don't tend to each other very often. So part of the hard part of fostering and adopting is not just dealing immediately with the trauma of children in my home, but it's also honestly trying to do it in a system that's kind of broken. So it's, spending half the day on the phone trying to find the right kind of health care, or spending another half day on the phone trying to find a place where we can get dentistry and, those sort of things. Right. But there is something actually, I think for me at least, really kind of powerful about the idea of a kind of a community model where I'm helping children. They're not my children, and that's okay. They're somebody else's child, and I actually have a great deal of empathy and compassion for their other parents. A lot of time children enter foster care because their parents have addiction issues. A lot enter foster care because their parents are incarcerated, because their parents, we're actually seeing a lot of homeless children who are themselves the children of parents who are homeless. So the problem is kind of growing bigger as we go on. So there's a lot of reasons why. I'm not sure if that quite answers your questions about fostering.
It does.
Yeah.
I mean, partly because I think one of the things that, this looks like a butterfly in your face, but it's in your face.
We keep talking. We're talking through this. Here we go.
Something bad is about to happen to this. Bam.
Everything that's broken in my house is from me, by the way. So. But I'm not usually allowed to touch things in my house because it's not the kids. I have to fess up. I'm the one that breaks everything.
One of the reasons that I asked that, and it does answer the question, is that a lot of times, if you go into a lot of people who go into foster parenting think that naively that all this child needs is love. Mm-hmm. And that's just a little bit of what they need. And there are so many kids who, when somebody's kind to them, that feels dangerous, because when people are kind to me, it's because they want to take advantage of me, or they're going to trick me, or those kind of things. And that's the thing that I thought was so clear in this book. And then when I went back and looked at your history and doing the foster care, I know every one of those foster kids, mm-hmm. you have to treat differently. You have to know. You have to figure it out each time.
Exactly, and that's actually kind of a gift in a way. I think one of the gifts of becoming a parent through the foster system is I never assumed that the kids would be like me. Yeah. Each child is like a fresh opportunity. It's this beautiful opportunity to get to know somebody. Yeah. And actually, it's kind of neat. Like the more recent teen foster daughter I had, every child brings in new traditions. She wanted to teach us how to cook some of the dishes from her home culture. There's some opportunities there to actually kind of to embrace that as a positive. Like each child is different and is going to be handling their trauma differently. And it can be very, very hard. But at the same time, I think for me that just illustrates how we really need to talk more about trauma in our culture, because we all have it.
Right.
We're all hurt by something at some point, and it's always an opportunity for us to kind of grow. But I think you're absolutely right. It's not a situation where love fixes everything. My oldest son came to me with severe attachment issues, and he would rage. As part of the article they mentioned, I talked about that a bit. And we didn't just go through hard months, it was hard years. It took years. But now he's 21, and he's doing awesome. I'm really proud of him. I always tell myself, I'm not going to brag about my kids, so I'll stop right there. When you leave, I'll just be showing you all pictures of my kids. I'll say, look at this one.
You get your phone out.
I got my phone all ready.
And this is kind of a craft question because, you know, we see this problem, and you sit down, you're going to write about it, and it's intimate. I mean, one of the things I love about this book is there are these details that just tell us that you know exactly what you're talking about. They're real because they're these little things that nobody would think of. You couldn't make this up for her life, and both for for Celia's life and Naomi's life. But there's another whole element to this, and it's a whodunit. I mean, this is a suspenseful story. And you read a lot of books, and the plot is the king, and then you look at another one, the character is the king. This is one of the best balanced things I've read in a long, long time. I wonder how you did that.
Oh, thank you. You know, it's and I really appreciate you saying that, because we're sitting here talking about these kind of really heavy, dark things, and it's easy to think that, oh, it's going to be a dark book, and I don't want to write books where people have to punish themselves to read it. You know, it's like, oh,
damn, that was a good book.
Yeah, you have to read this book. It's really important for me because books saved my life. The library saved my life. Reading stories, because when I was a homeless child, I would read books. I remember I would pretend that the parents in those books were my parents. And I would escape into this world of imagination. So it's really important for me to write books that are imbued with kind of hopefulness. But also, honestly, they have to have an exciting story. Yeah. And so, you know, it is, you know, one of my favorite reviews said that I write thrillers that are written as poems. So it's important to have that balance. I want something that when you're reading it, I want you to want to turn the page because it's an exciting story, and you want to, you know, I want to write books where people are immersed in the characters, get to know the characters, they have real issues, and yet it also works as a story because stories are just too wonderful. Yeah. When
you get to the car chase part, you know, which is like there's a car chase part,
there's no helicopters.
And I won't do the spoiler. When you get to the car chase part, one of the things I found myself asking myself is, you know, I haven't met Rene. I wonder if she's a nice person or not. What is she about to do to me? But there is that you get to a certain place there, and you're going to finish the book. You know, if you're hearing it on audio tape, you're going to waste gas. You're going to keep driving around the block to keep finding a place to park.
You know, I got to say, it's really interesting to me because I can read a book a day. I'm one of those people too. But as a writer, I have to say it's really funny when people come up and they said, I read your book in a day. And I was like, well, it took me so long to write it.
I know.
Can't you slow down a little bit?
I know. That's just the worst thing in the world to hear.
Isn't it? In a way, it's kind of like, oh, ow.
Yeah.
You know, it took me a year to write this book. Somebody should have at least take a week, right?
Yeah, you want to write a book they have to put down.
No, I'm not sure I want to do that either. I guess we're stuck, aren't we?
Really. I think we have a reading, and I want to make sure that we get the reading in. Can we do that now and then?
We have time for audience Q&A as well?
Yeah, I think we do.
That's always my favorite part, by the way. I love to hear from you guys and things that you want to say. But I think we're going to do the reading first.
I was going to do a reading, and then I thought, what if I read the part that the reader's going to read?
Do you want to read, or do we want to bring Colleen out? Colleen? We have a reading, and we can. But you can read too. I've heard you read before. If this writing thing doesn't work out, you can do Audible.
There we go.
Celia was in the library. It was her favorite place to be, besides her own imagination. She perched, sneakers swinging, in one of the wood chairs. The hard chair didn't bother her. Nothing bothered her in the library. Her head floated up to the clouds, the ornate ceiling above, and when her hand touched the rails of the marble staircase, she became part of the world. The best part of the library was becoming one of the butterflies. She carefully turned a page. She was reading her favorite book on butterflies, the one with the dull blue cover that gave no hint of the treasures inside. The edges were gray to the point of silver, like the dust of butterfly wings, Celia thought. The elderly librarian kept this book behind the counter just for Celia. It was a secret they shared, a good secret. Once, when she was in 3rd grade, a neighbor had invited Celia to her house for soup. The librarian reminded Celia of that neighbor. It helped her remember there were nice people in the world. She didn't blame them for what had happened. They were too busy taking care of each other. Celia could spend hours inside the book. She touched the color plates with her dirty fingers. The butterfly colors leapt off the page, a skyrocket of red, the brightest blue you ever saw, the gold of a perfect sunset. On pieces of scrap paper nearby, she drew the pictures of the butterflies, some fantastical, some real. When she was done, she tucked these inside the book like treasures. Celia, it was Rich in a hoarse whisper. Rich hated the library. He said the library made him smell like piss. Of course, that wasn't really true. It was just the warm, dry, close air that made it obvious. Celia didn't tell him this. You can go. I'll come later, she told Rich, who put down his comic. It's almost dark, he began. I'll catch up with you. You know where. Celia was lost in the butterflies. Rich left. It was getting wet and cold outside, moisture dripping from the building eaves. The last of the day people were leaving their offices, hurrying through the darkening mist. Overhead, a giant black clock ticked. 7 o'clock. In the room above him, Celia was swinging her feet, smiling and reading. She pulled a piece of paper forward to draw another butterfly. Outside, the man with the mashed face and cauliflower ears was waiting. He saw Rich leave. The girl was alone inside.
Whoa. Thank you.
So now let's get some questions from the experts.
Yes. You gonna play Donahue? No, because wait, we don't have any upstairs, so that might be okay tonight. Normally, y'all run me around.
Yeah. Questions? Questions right here. Here we go.
How old were you, and when did you get out of homelessness, and who helped you? How did that go?
Sure, make sure I got that right. How old was I, and then how did I get out of homelessness? Who helped me? So I was almost... Well, let me see. To be accurate, starting when I was about 12, I wasn't in my home very much anymore. Had a lot of homeless children are hidden in the population because they end up couch surfing or going home to home, staying with people that are not safe. It happens a lot. And then by the time I was 15, I was living full time on the streets. And when I was 16, I got my work permit, and I got a job at McDonald's. And I vividly remember my rusty purple-colored uniform. I was actually quite proud of it. It was amazing to have a job. And so I worked at McDonald's, and something that happened, the way that I got off the streets is very difficult anymore, is on the basis of that minimum wage job, I was able to rent a small studio apartment. And so actually one of the big barriers to getting out of homelessness now is rising rent costs and housing costs in a lot of areas, especially where I was at in Portland. When I got off the streets, I think I paid $120 a month for this little cockroach-infested studio apartment. But it had a lock on the door. And I'll never forget that feeling of being able to lock the door and how safe I felt. And I would still go to the library all the time and take home big paper sacks of books. And So, and I think that route off the streets isn't as available anymore, and which is why having shelters and agencies like you guys have here is so important, because there needs to be a safe place where kids can go and hopefully get jobs and start that process of finding a ways off the streets. And there were people that helped me. A lot of times it was, I can't overstate how important it was, even the little gestures. At the downtown Portland library where I went so much, there was an elderly librarian that worked there. At least when you're 15, everybody. She was probably my age, right? In my childlike memory, she was quite old. But I'll never forget, she would save food for me behind her desk and do things like, I would come in, I'm sure I looked like a drowned, filthy rat half the time, and she would, just without saying anything, hand me a can of nuts that she had kept for me. And those little, when you're on the streets, people just look through you. And after a while, it became hard to believe that I even existed anymore. And it was so hard to convince myself that I was even real. And the only times that people really look at you when you're homeless is when they want something very bad from you. So that was my process. I got that little studio apartment. I worked really hard. I did a lot of service jobs for a long time. Ended up working in restaurants, waitressing, bartending. And then when I was in my 20s, before I started taking in kids, I actually went into freelance journalism, which is how I got started with my writing career. And I just met a lot of really wonderful people along the way, and I think it's really important to recognize that. So many little things of people helping me. The first newspaper that hired me, just on the basis of something I had typed up and written for them. And they paid me I think $40 for every record review that I wrote, So yeah, I don't know if that quite answers it, but that was my particular path. I had a lot of friends on the streets at the time. Most of them died. I lost dear friends to murder. One friend I lost to the Green River Killer. I wrote about that in an essay. I lost a lot of friends to addiction. I had a friend who jumped off a freeway overpass after being raped and died by suicide that way. I lost a lot of friends to AIDS. So it was, I know I'm lucky. I'm very lucky to be here. It makes me very grateful for everything I have. Thank you.
In Spokane, we have a bus that picks children up at shelters and then distributes them to what had formerly been their home schools. What advice do you have for teachers about working with these kids that come in late, have to go get breakfast, maybe don't get to class until 2 hours late, and then leave early because the bus comes for them early?
Yeah. I want to make sure I understood that right. So there's a bus that drives around to pick up homeless children, make sure they get to school. And
It's called the Heart Bus. The Heart Bus.
Yeah, okay. Oh, are you an educator?
Yes.
Oh, thank you for all you do. I've seen a lot of this in my neighborhood too. There's a significant number of students now that are homeless. There's a lot of homelessness. And again, it's often a really invisible population because a lot of these kids, in my neighborhood, kids, just kind of go couch to couch. And unfortunately, they end up in homes. There's people out there that prey on this. It's very sad. Or they live in shelters. And it's really hard when you're homeless. I ended up going back and getting my general equivalency because when I was on the streets, there's no way I could go to school. And I think the advice for teachers, I think you guys have it very hard because you're already dealing with these often underfunded, overcrowded classrooms and kids that have a lot of different issues. I wish there was a way to get the kids picked up a little earlier. I love it. Our school actually does free breakfast. It's a little thing, but they have breakfast. The kids can walk in the door. Our high schools and local schools in our neighborhood, there's a lot of poverty in my neighborhood. They get to take the breakfast with them to class, which is a model that I would love to see more of. but being able to address those simple human needs. And I think we also just need to it would be lovely to see us take some of the shame and stigma out of it so that the kids who are experiencing homelessness don't have to feel so bad about themselves. So thank you for that question.
Over here?
For being a teacher. Yes.
I find it very interesting, Rene, that your name, Rene, is the masculine form of Rene. And I wonder where, whoever named you, did the person want a boy? because the French for you would be adding another E and an accent grave this way. So it's still pronounced the same way, but it's spelled the feminine way, and you have it the masculine way.
I do, and I have a funny quick story. My first novel, I got to go to France for it, which is a huge honor. And so I went to France, and I was thinking, I have a French name, like feeling really proud of myself. I thought, I want to be popular in France because I have a French name. And I got there, and people, every time they met me, they just cracked up. And it turned out that not only is it a French male name, but it's a very old-fashioned, unpopular name. And so it's kind of like having the name Engelbert. And and everywhere I went, it was like, this is Engelbert. And French people just died laughing. I tried to go into French Starbucks, and they were just cracking up, no, your name. So I think it probably says a lot about my family history that I ended up with this name that my mother didn't know how to spell.
She's basically a boy named Sue.
Yeah, I am the boy named Sue.
Right here.
I'm just kind of interested as sort of an adoptive parent of homeless kids. What kind of problems have you seen, and how have you adapted to those difficulties as a parent of adult kids, not adult but older kids?
Yeah. So the question is, what kind of problems have I seen as a foster adoptive parent, and how have I adapted? Actually, honestly, I think having the history I did was just really helpful. And also, I've only adopted from foster care, and I've only taken in kids that are labeled special needs, so I don't know any better. I just,
Relativity.
It's all relative. To give you an example, and I'm very careful and I never talk about my children's private stories because that's their story, and I don't talk about their histories or anything that's private for them. And I'm very respectful of that. But to give an example, I had a child who had been very traumatized and a common coping mechanism for girl children who have been very traumatized is to become very passive and super compliant. And, you've all heard of fight, flight, but there's another one, and it's called fawn. And some women learn to fawn. They learn to become people pleasers to a very detrimental extent. And because of my own trauma history, I was working with this. And I actually look at my relationships with my children as something I'm always learning about. I take them to counseling. I'm always exploring ways to help them. So it's a very therapeutic relationship, and I approach it that way from the get-go. But with this particular girl, actually, I remember having a talk with her one time, and I said, I think for you right now, I hope that someday soon you get angry. And I remember her being she was stunned, and she said, "You want me to get mad?" And I said, "Yes." I said, because what happened to you was wrong. And it was interesting because it was a revelation for me too. And it was a recognition that I think we have a right to be angry at the people who have betrayed us. And we have to go through that anger before we get to a better place. And that's kind of what I saw her do, is she got to the place where she could finally be angry, and that led her to a place of healing. But a lot of times, when children can't be good at being good, they end up being good at being bad. And that's something I've seen a lot of, and I try to recognize that. If you can't be good at being good, you will be good at being bad. So a lot of the negative behaviors we see in children that have experienced trauma are symptoms. And I just try to remember that all the time, that this child might be raging or acting up because they're in pain. And it's my job to help them with that. So.
And so much of the time, you'd rather have anger than invisibility. I mean,
Yes.
anger at least can be empowering. Any kid who has some sense that he or she can influence what happens next is in way better shape than
and
that
actually,
disappeared kid.
And anger is a way to say, I exist, I have rights.
Yeah.
I deserve something better than this. But the key, of course, is, I remember talking with this particular child, and it's like, yes, I want you to get mad, and then I want you to learn how to appropriately express it.
Exactly. We'll work on that later.
This is the goal here. It doesn't mean you get to trash your room.
And in this town, one of the things that, and I think you're to some degree, to a great degree, I think this book is an indictment of the system. The fact that systemically we're not doing what we need to do. I worked in the world of child abuse and neglect in one way or another for like 35 years, and I think I left it in worse shape than I found it. And so much of it was because no funding and that kind of thing. And one of the things that I think is so important about a book like this is that everybody in this room reads this book and you do something different the next time you see a homeless person, because you can't always give them money, you can't always give them the thing they need, but you can notice. And that's what happened.
I totally agree. Yeah, absolutely. And I want to add, I don't believe that there's a hierarchy of activism. What I'm doing is not any better than what somebody else does. We all make change our own ways. And we're all kind of called to different things. And for some person, it might be volunteering or fostering, but for somebody else, it might be making change like in their classroom, or helping out financially. I think there's always something we can do, and those small things that we do actually are really significant. Absolutely. Yes.
Hi, my question is regarding runaway children, and it's kind of twofold. We used to talk about the superhero disabled person that was held up in the media, and everybody says, gee, why can't you do that? And then on the flip side of that, I talk to kids who say, nobody has any expectations for me. And so has the kids that you cared for, have they ever addressed that issue at all? Is there a preference for, because I feel bad. I feel bad when I hear kids say, nobody has any expectations for me.
That's a beautiful question. And I think you're absolutely right. On one side, there's a danger of just expecting kids to be so resilient or to be the superhero and not tend to their needs. And then the other side is having zero expectations, which interestingly is a way of not tending to their needs either, right? So absolutely, just speaking from my personal experience, I'm, as a parent, just a huge fan of structure and expectations. The kids that I parent often come from complete chaos. So there's been periods in my life where the fridge is covered with this long white sheet, and I have every single thing that's going to happen during the day written down, because they're comforted by knowing what's going to happen. If you've come from a background where the unexpected often happens and the unexpected is often very terrible, it's nice to know what's going to occur. But I think you're absolutely right. I think having reasonable expectations is a beautiful thing, because an expectation is also a recognition that somebody exists. And it's very empowering, because it's a way of saying, hey, I believe in you. I know you can get to school today. In fact, I expect you to go to school today. Now I'm sounding like this is me as a mom. I expect you to go to
the mom voice.
You damn well better be at school today.
Yes.
Renee, so I work.
There you are.
We started Safety Net, and we help kids as they age out of foster care. And I'm wondering if you have a recommendation on what I could say when it's the community raises the money that we use to help these kids get on their feet. Is there anything that you've come across when working with foster children that you can say they're jaded, they're hurt, they always think that there's strings attached to everything that they get? Any recommendations on what we might say to let them know this is truly the community that's behind them, that's trying to support them, that this is free to them because of what they've been through? They come at us with such a feeling of dread and what's expected of me now, when it's truly just the community, totally grassroots, raising money to help these kids get on their feet the same way a parent would.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. Thank you for the work you're doing. For those of you that don't know, in Washington and Oregon, the age-out age in foster care is 18. And what that means basically, and I've seen this happen, is when a child turns 18, they're pretty much thrown out of foster care. And if you can imagine trying to survive at age 18 without a home to go to on Christmas, without somebody to even call and say, how do I make this can of tomato soup? You know, this is why so many children in foster care end up homeless or in prison in places, because it's just an impossible task. So, first of all, I wish we could change the laws. I think that the age that children exit out of foster care should be 21. I think that's a lot more realistic nowadays. They need that extra time. But absolutely, because by the time a child is 18 and they've been bounced around 30, 40 homes or whatever, I think first of all we have to recognize that as sad and tragic as it is, we are not going to repair their vision of family anytime soon. And so, you know, creating an environment where they know that they can come get help without somebody doing that to them, without somebody trying. I mean, at this point, what they need to do is learn how to be an adult, which is really terrible and sad. But I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I think we need to create an environment where this person knows I can come get some help. These people aren't going to be telling me that I need to do X, Y, and Z, and a way to communicate that to the community. You know, exactly. Yes.
All right, one last question.
Of course.
Thank you for being here. So I hear that the children who are homeless want to be seen. I hear that if you see them, they think you want something from them. And what I see on the streets is that if I see them, then they often are aggressive to me. And I realize that each child's different, but how do I respond?
Thank you for your honesty. I think that's really important. Thank you. You know, when I'm talking about homeless, there's a lot of different homeless children out there. And there's large populations, like when I was on the streets, I think there's a pack of us younger kids that stuck together for safety, and we were probably largely invisible because it was safer to be kind of invisible. And then you do have sometimes packs of older youth that can, you know, one of the problems with homelessness is, and there's been studies that show this, but we all know, I know this anecdotally as well, is a lot of people become homeless, and at the time they become homeless, they don't have an addiction issue. But after some time on the streets, they often develop addiction issues. And so homelessness actually can come with a variety of kind of cultures that are created. And people kind of become enculturated into this. And they can become, you know, get involved in street families and street groups that are very aggressive. They can get involved with, I had friends that got involved in crime and did bad things. And I think it's absolutely reasonable for us all to be safe and want to feel safe. Absolutely. And I think one thing to do is, and I'm a big proponent of this, we have a lot of panhandlers, for instance, in our area. And I personally, I'm a mom on a budget, and being a writer doesn't pay that much, right? So if I'm going to have money to spare, I'm going to actually give that money to a social service agency that is helping those youth. We all make our own choices, right? So you don't have to feel that you need to engage with somebody or give them $20 that you expect that they're going to use on a drug. You know, you can do something that you think is meaningful and safe. And I think that's really important to note. You don't have to engage with people that are, being aggressive or experiencing different issues. Absolutely. I think in general, when I'm talking about just seeing people, I think it's just recognizing even those people that are out there with addiction or mental health issues, just recognizing their humanity and our need to do something collectively. Does that make sense? Yes.
One of the things I really like about this story is that it shows that. I mean, there's the issue of homelessness, but there are minor characters in this story, and they're important. They're not particularly there a lot, but what it shows you is that there are friendships that are being had out there, there are interactions that are being had out there, there are things to look for so that we can help, so that it isn't just this thing of, do I look at this person or not look at this person when I don't feel safe? If I don't feel safe, I'm going to keep myself safe. But there are going to be some times when it is safe to go ahead and notice.
Absolutely.
And you're always smart to keep care of your personal safety.
And just on a closing note, I think it's something that when we start being conscious of, then we can be aware and we can start asking our politicians, what are they doing? And we can just, be informed about the issues. Yeah. So thank you.
There's one more question. Hi, my name is Rob Curley, long-time listener, first-time caller. So of the three of us on stage, only one of us has been in Vogue magazine.
Oh my gosh.
Could you explain to us how you ended up in Vogue magazine? And I was so happy to see this photo because I said, if it gets rough tonight, we have muscle. So tell us about this photo.
This is actually a picture of me in my 20s, and it is in Vogue magazine. I can guarantee you it will be the only time I am ever in Vogue magazine. So after I got off the streets in that small studio apartment and worked at McDonald's and so on, there was a point several years later where I decided to become a boxer. And at that time, women had just won the right to compete in amateur boxing. Actually, until that point, women had actually been prohibited from amateur boxing. And amateur boxing, for those of you who don't know, is the Olympic kind of boxing where you wear headgear and such. So I decided I was going to be a boxer, and I went to a little gym in Portland called the Grand Avenue Boxing Gym, and I was the only woman there. And the boxing team I was on was called the Sandovals, after my dearly missed coach, Jess Sandoval, who was this little old Mexican fighter. And the entire team was not only men, but they were all Mexican men, and they were all like little bantamweight fighters, and they all had like cauliflower ears and like no profile. Jess wasn't really good at defense, I'll say that much. It was all about wading in and this scrappy little Mexican fighting. And, I fell just passionately in love with the sport. And it was huge for me because I'm not a very big person. And I had been, honestly, terribly victimized on the streets. And I had been victimized before I was on the streets. And I had always been the victim. And to learn how to fight back was just so transformative for me. And actually, the interesting thing, so that Jess became like a surrogate father figure to me. He was a father figure to all these boys. All these boys came from really rough places. But when you came to the gym, you had respect. And Jess, you had to show Jess your report card if you were in school. And you weren't allowed to join a gang. These kids weren't allowed to. Jess was like a strict father figure. And he taught me how to fight back. It was life-changing for me and the experience. So I ended up actually, this is a funny claim to fame, I was the first woman to win a Golden Gloves in actually the state of Washington. So And that led.
And that was the part I wanted to hear.
Yes.
And I have to tell you that I heard this story about an hour before, and I saw this picture about an hour before this interview, and I rearranged the entire interview. I will ask her no questions.
He kind of stepped away. He's like, okay.
I'm going to get my nose flattened.
Yeah. So actually, they ended up Vogue magazine. Actually, and it was on ESPN. It was so funny. I have the tapes. My kids think it's just hysterical. You know, sometimes my mom play that ESPN. They just laugh. They just laugh and laugh. Then I make cookies.
Well, thank you all, and thank you. So we have some drawings to give away, and this is really just an excuse so that you guys can get into the back,
Oh, thank you.
and so we can go have, because we're all going to go buy books.
Thank you.
Right? So, thank you.
Thank you, guys. I so appreciate it. Thank you. All right, back there. Okay.
You betcha.
All right, thank you. Oh, yes, of course.